Music has been an integral part of the human experience as long as humanity has been around. And I think it's intuitively been felt for a long time that music can have healing properties. This is, I think, pretty safe to say, certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, choir of persons with Parkinson's disease in the world. The areas for being able to perceive music and also to make music have overlap. We now have the tools to be able to answer more specific questions about how it is that music affects the brain and other body systems, and therefore we have the incredible opportunity to tailor music, use precision music medicine, if you will, for the purposes of healing. I'm Pantelyat, and I'm an assistant professor of neurology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and it's been an absolute thrill for me to co-found and co-direct the Johns Hopkins Center for Music and Medicine. Music is what I would be doing if I weren't doing medicine. I decided that, in a sense, medicine was an easier way out than the classical. Sometimes. The vision that we have for our Center for Music and Medicine is to bring music and medicine together by making music an integral part of treating illness.
This collaboration consists of research activities, clinical care, and education and outreach, spread out among a wide range of different people from different aspects of the healthcare system and the School of Medicine faculty, as well as Peabody musicians and Peabody faculty.
There is a lot of research on music and neurological disease, such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, stroke, rehabilitation.
This is not a new idea. In shamanistic cultures, if you can see the shamanistic healers use music. It's part of their regulars, their aspirin. Now we can objectively measure some of these impacts that music has on people.
Part of what we're trying to do here is produce rigorous research at the level of Johns Hopkins standards to further the field.
We know music activates a host of different areas of the brain. In fact, some have said that listening to music, making music, activates more parts of the brain than just about any other human activity, which of course is what makes it so complicated to study, if everything is getting activated at the same time.
It's a whole body experience with sensory motor demands. It's a good diet for people suffering from neurodegenerative diseases if they engage in actively making music.
It's fascinating and very powerful to think that something that's been floating around in our environment forever, to think that this natural, omnipresent human activity actually has demonstrable benefit as treatment and medicine.
Well, wow. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our wonderful co-sponsors, the Center for Music and Medicine and the Department of Neurology. Now, before I turn the program over to our moderator, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A in the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to our moderator, Kaylin Kopcho, Senior Associate Director of Development for the Department of Neurology.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It looks like we have just shy of 100 participants so far. And I think that video was a fantastic place to get us started. It provided an excellent introduction to our presenter today, Dr. Alexander Pantelyat, who is an assistant professor of neurology at the Johns Hopkins Department of Neurology. He also serves as co-founder and co-director of the Center for Music and Medicine, the director of our atypical Parkinsonian clinic, and the director of the co-director of our Movement Disorder Fellowship. And so with that, I will pass it to Alex, who's going to take us through a little bit of an introductory presentation, and then we're going to go into Q&A. So please do use the function to send your questions over, and we will answer them as it makes sense in the order of the program, or at the after Alex has provided his introduction. Alex, take it away.
Kaylin, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. And it is my pleasure to Zoom with everyone this afternoon and tell you a little bit about music-based interventions for Parkinson's disease and related disorders. Just wanted to check, and everyone see the slideshow on the screen, maybe with a thumbs up. All right, we have 2 of them. Fantastic. So without further ado, as Kaylin mentioned, I will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes to give you a taste of what we're really after here, that will expand on the ideas germinating in the video that you just saw. And then I hope that there will be plenty of time for interactive question and answer. So our vision, the Johns Hopkins Center for Music and Medicine, can be summarized with the motto, music as medicine, medicine for musicians. It is a dual vision that focuses on using music and rhythm-based interventions to help heal diseases such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and ultimately moving beyond neurology. Also important to us is the development of a new field of medicine, that is sports medicine for musicians. Our mission is to bring music and medicine together by making music and rhythm an integral part of treating illnesses and by improving the health of musicians the worldwide. Here, I'm gonna get straight into the nitty-gritty of anatomy, neuroanatomy, as it pertains to music processing. What is it that happens in the brain when we hear a melody or when we sing or when we're playing a musical instrument? Well, the answer is a lot. So no one has to memorize anything in the slide. There won't be a quiz question for this afterwards, but what you're looking at here are sagittal views, cutaway slices longitudinally, think of it this way, in the brain. So you have the lateral side surface of the brain, the right hemisphere over in the left-hand panel here, and then you have a mid-sagittal section straight down the middle of the brain over in the right-hand panel. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the networks, the connected regions of the brain that are activated all at the same time very often when we simply hear a melody or when we're trying to make music. So in green, there are circles representing the basic auditory pathway. Well, this is not a surprise. Music, just like any other sound, enters the ear and then is processed in a specific standardized way in the temporal lobe and other connected areas. So we're perceiving the basic features of music, you know, how loud it is, how high pitched it is, you know, frequency, loudness and decibels, etc. Next, moving on to a more complex features of music is you have circles in turquoise representing the musical syntactic network. So understanding higher order musical features. And you could see that these circles are spread apart in multiple areas, multiple lobes, large subdivisions of the brain. A key area, for example, to process some higher order features of music is the temporal plane, or in Latin, the planum temporale, which is a wedge-shaped area within the temporal lobe of the brain that is part of, but also distinct from, the key area of the brain that processes language. That's called the Wernicke area in the temporal lobe. I'll return to that in a little bit as we're setting up the rest of the talk through this key slide. Next, we have pink circles that represent the attention and working memory network. So important areas of the frontal lobe, but also the inferior parietal lobe, for example, being able to focus on what you're hearing, what you're listening to, and keeping track of music, such as the beat of music, where the melody is going over time. The attention and working memory network, which is impaired in diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, for instance, this is being activated just by listening to music. Very importantly, again, and a theme of Alzheimer's disease, the episodic memory network is activated by melody, by different types of music, being able to recognize the music that you've heard before and recalling any associated memories. There could be very powerful memories, autobiographical memories elicited, both short-term and long-term, by listening to music. Think about, for instance, the song that you danced to at your wedding. Now, if there was a bitter divorce that followed that wedding at some point, then that song could elicit a mix of emotions, some maybe predominantly negative memories. So this is to introduce the concept that one size does not fit all when it comes to music-based interventions. What could be very pleasurable for someone, for another person, it could be very unpleasant. So one size is not going to fit all when we're talking about music-based interventions. Now, importantly for Parkinson's disease, the blue circles represent the motor movement-related network. And here it's really quite widespread. You have areas deep in the brain, in the striatum, part of the deep centers or basal ganglia. You have the cerebellum, which is a key area in the lower back of the head here that serves to plan and coordinate speech and other movements like walking. And then, of course, you have the motor cortex itself right here in the frontal lobe. We will come back to that later when we discuss some specific mechanisms of how music can help. And then finally, but last but certainly not least, you have the reward and emotion processing network in orange, red circles over here. These are all centered kind of in the evolutionarily ancient, primitive, more primitive areas of the brain. The amygdala, that's something that would get activated. You might know this center as the fight or flight, response command center in the brain, part of the reptilian brain, where we're faced with a very negative, fearful stimulus. So music can certainly activate that. On the other hand, there's also the activation of the nucleus accumbens in the and the ventral tegmental area. These are key pleasure centers of the brain, if you will, that are involved in processing of reward and emotional network. By the way, these are some of the same areas that are activated by drugs of abuse, alcohol, cocaine, and others. So music can indeed activate some of those very same areas in similar ways. So now, another introductory slide to just frame the rest of our discussion. Now, this is something that my colleague, Dr. Anirudh Patel, came up with nearly 10 years ago. And this really pertains to the potential hypothesized benefits of music as it pertains to language. But I think that we can apply this beyond just the overlap with language activities, because it just subserves, it provides a framework for thinking about how music can positively impact a number of different activities. So Dr. Patel hypothesized that the benefits of music are driven by adaptive plasticity, change in brain connections over time, following this concept of, it's called the Hebbian principle, which is brain cells that fire together, fire at the same time, that are linked in their activity, they wire together. They end up having stronger connections to each other over time, synaptic connections. This is very important. And we also know that this is a process that doesn't just end in adulthood. People in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, people with or without neurodegenerative disorders, continue to form new connections. And in fact, in specific areas of the brain, continue to make new brain cells throughout the lifespan. So the question is, can music help that process? And the answer is there's some early indicators that it can. So Dr. Patel hypothesized that this neuroplasticity, change in the brain over time in response to music, occurs when the following conditions are met. And this is an acronym, OPERA. O stands for overlap. As I already mentioned, there's anatomical overlap in the brain networks that process sound features that are used both for music and for speech. P stands for precision. Music tends to place a higher level of demand, as anyone who has seriously studied music could know. It's a higher demand on the networks for sound processing than speech in terms of really the timing and precision. Speech has its own kind of ebb and flow, and there are parts of the brain that, of course, are supposed to, are dedicated to processing it. It's called prosody, kind of the melody of speech. But when it comes to listening to a melody, there is more of a demand on average placed on the brain when trying to process it versus just hearing regular speech. E stands for emotion. Again, this links back to the prior slide. The music activities that engage some of this shared network between music and language processing can elicit strong positive emotions, but I would add here also can elicit strong negative emotions through activating the amygdala, for instance. R in opera stands for repetition. Again, if anyone has studied singing or learned a musical instrument, you know that in order to get better, just like any other activity, you have to repeat, and practice makes perfect. The musical activities that engage this network need to be frequently repeated in order to bring about this neuroplasticity, positive change in the brain that's actually measurable. And finally, A stands for attention. The music activities that engage this network are associated with focused attention. If we're unable to focus on what we're doing, this includes listening to music and especially making music, then it's unlikely that we will be able to do a good job. So now just kind of skipping to a practical application. You may at this point be asking yourself, well, thankfully I don't have Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. How can music help me today, especially given everything that's going on in the world? Normally I'd be giving you a face-to-face talk, and at this point we are connecting through Zoom. Perhaps some of us are experiencing Zoom fatigue. How can music help? Well, we know that stress can exacerbate just about the symptoms of any disease. Parkinson's disease is certainly no exception. And we also know that calming music that has a rhythm that approximates that of a normal heart at rest, about 50 to 60 beats a minute, that tends to be instrumental as opposed to one involving words, that tends to have a lower pitch frequency, in other words, is less shrill, not as high pitched, and also one that has little in the way of extreme changes in loudness, in pitch, or rhythms. So this is generally what we think of as calming, relaxing music. In Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and a number of other illnesses, both patients and their care partners frequently report reductions in stress, improvements in mood symptoms, and reductions in anxiety symptoms during music listening that across a number of studies translate into a longer term benefit with a very important caveat. Practice makes perfect. You want to make it a habit, something that maybe takes you 5 minutes per day, specific 5 minutes out of the day that you could set out for yourself, and just listen to music that you know you enjoy. At this point, we're lucky to be able to do this for free very easily. You know, I have specific playlists that I play for my 2.5-year-old when he is hyper, and I have other playlists through Spotify and Pandora that I play when he is in need of a pick-me-up for his mood, for example. And the same thing goes for my wife and for me. So now I wanted to say a few words specifically about Parkinson's disease, which is, for me as a movement disorders neurologist, is a focus of what I do. It's the second most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's disease. Conservatively speaking, we'll have well over 1.5 million cases by 2050 in the United States alone. And honestly, I think that's an underestimate. What we teach our medical students is another acronym for the cardinal motor movement-related signs of Parkinson's disease that we look for on examination. T stands for tremor, that's shaking of a hand typically, but it could be any body part. R stands for rigidity, which is muscle stiffness, the large muscle groups of the arms and legs. A stands for akinesia, which is a somewhat misleading term. It really relates to bradykinesia, which is doctor speak for a reduction in the speed and coordination of fine, rapid movements like this, tapping your fingers, opening the hands rapidly and closing them, tapping the toes. And then finally, the P in TRAP, in the TRAP mnemonic, stands for postural instability. That's walking difficulty, changes in posture that accompany Parkinson's disease, typically stooping forward, and ultimately loss of balance that could lead to falls. And that is a serious risk and danger over time for patients suffering from Parkinson's disease. Now, how may music and rhythm work in Parkinsonian disorders? For those of you paying attention earlier, I think there was already a hint about it, but let me spell it out a little more clearly. We know that therapeutic music performance, playing for one's health benefit, or singing, could be used to improve both gross, meaning large amplitude movements, and fine movements, using this concept of rhythmic entrainment. And a number of studies have illustrated this both in healthy adults and in people affected by Parkinson's disease. So what's rhythmic entrainment? It's simply the patterning of our body processes, in other words, becoming in sync to, in terms of one's movements, to the rhythm of music. So think about tapping your foot to a beat that you like. Think about clapping along to a song that you enjoy at a concert or just listening to a recording. And think a little bit beyond that, because there's evidence that not only is it that you're tapping physically, even if you're not tapping, your heart rate may be aligned to what you're hearing. I mentioned music-assisted relaxation at 50 to 60 beats per minute. There's good evidence that across multiple disease states, music can, of a slower rate can lower the heart rate, for instance, as well as lower blood pressure, actually. And the key part for me as a neurologist is that the brain actually entrains, and there's some evidence for this as well that we could talk about in more detail. And so what's the idea overall? The idea is either to get around the faulty networks, the pathways that are broken in diseases like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, or augmenting, strengthening the pathways that are being affected using music and rhythm. So here is an illustration of what I'm talking about here. And again, this is hypothesized. We currently don't have enough evidence to say we're sure this is what's actually happening in human beings, but there's preliminary evidence to suggest this. So what you're seeing here are key areas of the brain responsible for planning and carrying out movement that we want to do. Say, take a step forward. So what you have here in yellow arrows with dots are internally generated movement areas. So you have the cerebellum in the back I mentioned, putamen, which is a key area in the deep nuclei, the basal ganglia I mentioned before, the thalamus, which is a relay center for all sensory input in the brain, and then you're going toward the frontal lobe, the supplementary motor area, or SMA, and you're ending up at the M1, or primary motor cortex, which I mentioned before is the key hub for the motor, for movement-related network. You have to get eventually at some point to the primary motor cortex, so then you could send electrical signal down to the spinal cord, then to the muscles to activate the parts of the body you want to activate and take a step forward, for example. So we know that this pathway outlined in yellow arrows is impaired due to loss of dopamine-producing cells in Parkinson's disease. These connections are impaired, and they tend to be more impaired as time goes on with the disease. So the question is, can we use music and rhythm to either strengthen the yellow pathway or get around it altogether via the cerebellum, for example, kind of around the back way? This is the front, by the way, and this is the back. This is the same sagittal view, a cutaway kind of down the middle of the brain that I mentioned before. Perhaps we can get around this entirely by going to the parietal cortex and ending up in the same key area that we need to activate, the primary motor cortex, in order to take a step forward and generate other movements. In other words, getting the auditory cortex involved, getting around using this white arrow pathway, and ending up where we need to end up, and being able to walk better. So this brings us to rhythmic auditory stimulation. Typically, this approach, which by the way was first described in the 1970s, it's not new, has been used for gait rehabilitation in several diseases, including Parkinson's disease, stroke, and more recently, multiple sclerosis. The rhythm is used as an external timekeeper, and the sound cues are provided by a metronome or recorded or live music that has a strong march-like beat. The idea is to allow a patient to anticipate their next step so they could align them better in order to walk in a more normal manner and improve their walking parameters and hopefully reduce the risk of falls. So there are a number of ways that this could be done, and we could talk about that in the Q&A in more detail if you'd like. Now, what about singing? Music therapy to improve voice. In Parkinson's disease, over time, there's a problem that with the voice that impairs communication. Even in the course of a single sentence, Sometimes the volume just really tends to drop off over time. And also there's a loss of clarity of speech. Sometimes words and syllables run over and top of each other, and all of this can really impair things. This is especially true now when we are perhaps speaking more on the phone, when we don't have face-to-face interaction as much during the pandemic. And you know that if the person in conversation with you can't see your lips moving, it makes it more difficult to be understood. So this is a real issue for people with Parkinson's disease and a number of other neurological illnesses. So music therapy, music-based interventions can really help in several ways. Now, what about drumming? Well, we know that drumming has long been a part of traditional healing rituals in various cultures, including those on the African continent and many others. When I was still in training in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, a group of patients with Parkinson's disease who participated in our annual retreat took part in a West African drum circle class, which was done in partnership with a community-based West African drumming group. And after 45 minutes of this class, they really came up to us and said they felt better with respect to many of their symptoms of the disease. For example, people said that their walking got better, their freezing of gait, which is when feet tend to get stuck to the ground, that got better. And people generally reported a sense of improved well-being. So what we did to follow up on this is design a pilot study that we published now almost 5 years ago to look at West African drum circle classes in an effort to improve well-being and movement in Parkinson's disease. So we had a group of 10 patients with Parkinson's disease who did twice a week, hour-long West African drum circle classes. Everyone had a drum while they were seated down. And there was a comparison group who pursued, with 10 people with Parkinson's disease who pursued their usual care. And so at the end, what we found was that there was a significant improvement in self-reported quality of life as measured by our validated Parkinson's disease quality of life questionnaire. But here I just want to share with you a few reflections from our participants in the drumming group. One person said, drumming forced you to focus on the rhythm that you were playing without becoming distracted by the music of other people. One person who had significant restless fidgety movements, think about the actor Michael J. Fox, who's had long-standing Parkinson's disease on TV. He has a lot of dyskinesias, restless fidgety type movements. And we had a patient who had severe dyskinesias that he felt were harnessed during the drumming. Another person said, which was really interesting to us, that he found he was able to coordinate his hands even when he was off his usual medications. In other words, the usual Parkinson's disease medications had worn off and he didn't have the time to take his next dose, and he still felt better. So again, to kind of switch gears, to give you some ideas in case you wanted to ask follow-up questions, I was very excited to hear about this. Back in 2018, the British Health Secretary Matt Hancock proposed to enable UK doctors in the national health system to prescribe therapeutic, art, or hobby-based treatments for illnesses including dementia. The concept behind this is that of social prescribing. In other words, instead of or in addition to prescribing pills, I would be able to prescribe for my patients the attendance at a concert by the Baltimore Symphony, to join the Parkinsonics group in Baltimore, which helps people with Parkinson's disease and related disorders in terms of their voice and their well-being and quality of life. We could talk more about that in a little bit. To go to an art gallery and or a museum to enjoy that and have that attendance, have the participation in these community-based groups be covered by health insurance. Imagine that. A similar campaign launched in Montreal in the fall of 2018, and shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic, the state of Massachusetts was the first to launch a pilot social prescribing program through its Massachusetts Arts Council. I certainly hope that with a lot of work in the next few decades, we could bring this to all states in our country. Another thing I'm very excited about that we could expand on is there is a NIH, National Institutes of Health, partnership with the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. This was kicked off in 2017 and is now a yearly a series of presentations, currently virtual. Actually, there's a monthly series at the Kennedy Center website you can take a look at with Renee Fleming, the wonderful mezzo-soprano from the Met, who is now an artistic director for the Kennedy Center. Importantly for me as a researcher, last year was the first year on record that the National Institutes of Health actually agreed to fund millions of dollars worth of research pertaining to the effect of music on health. And another funding opportunity is expected any day now this year in 2020. At this point, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was fantastic. We have quite a few questions that have come in over the course of your presentation. So I'm going to do my best to synthesize them and make sure that we do get through most, if not all. You know, you had mentioned, and I think, you know, the video at the beginning really provided us with a good introduction to choral-based interventions for Parkinson's with our fantastic Parkinsonics group that started as a clinical trial. I know there's some other really, really cool work that you and your colleagues are engaged in right now. So if you might, I want to make sure that we move through these questions, but if you might just pick one or two other current or recently completed research projects that show the scope and the impact of music as medicine in the movement disorders spectrum, really appreciate hearing about that.
Thank you, Kaylin. Thank you for all those who are asking these questions. I again want to emphasize Parkinsonics for multiple reasons. The Parkinsonics was the first clinical research study under the umbrella of the Center for Music and Medicine that we did about nearly 5 years ago. And it really serves as a blueprint in my mind for what we are trying to do, because we were able to transition the participants of the study who were very interested in continuing to sing on a weekly basis. Once the study was completed, we were able to transition this to a community-based group that has been going strong prior to the pandemic at Govans Presbyterian Church in Baltimore City on York Road, and now perhaps even stronger via Zoom. There was a world premiere performance, for instance, that the Parkinsonics gave recently, and there's a YouTube video available that I'm happy to share with those who are interested. So again, in my mind, the blueprint, just as we did with the Parkinsonics, is to develop clinical research projects that, if they're bearing out and showing promise, and there's more importantly interest on the part of the participants to continue music-based interventions beyond the formal research trial period, to be able to support and integrate into the greater Baltimore community these kinds of resources. This is, in my mind, connected to the social prescribing idea that I mentioned, because if there are the Parkinsonics, if there's a group dedicated to drumming, which I'm going to say a few words about now, then I could refer my patients and I could refer other people's patients to those groups if we feel like that's something that could benefit them. So very briefly, about 2.5 years ago, we partnered with our wonderful School of Music, Peabody, to bring forth a study called Guitar PD, where we looked at group guitar classes to improve mood, reduce anxiety, improve quality of life, and movement-specific measures like typing in people with Parkinson's disease. Well, not all of the measures improved from a statistically significant standpoint. But again, before the study was even over, the majority of participants came to us, the study organizers, and said, we are really enjoying this. If at all possible, we'd like to continue taking group lessons of guitar from these wonderful teachers. And sure enough, that has led to the PD Strummers program through Peabody, where there is a significant subsidy for people with Parkinson's disease who would like to take group lessons in guitar performance. Parkinsonics, by the way, I'm jumping back to the choir-based group, which is just really something that's my pride and joy. And I'm so happy to say that we are supporting that through the Center for Music and Medicine and our Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorder Center at Johns Hopkins, with all of the sessions free of charge for participants. And then the most recent undertaking, based on a follow-up pilot study that we did in Parkinson's disease and Huntington disease patients that we completed last year, called Drum PDHD, we are in the advanced stages of planning virtual drumming classes for people with Parkinson's disease that we hope to soon expand to those with Huntington disease as well, initially via Zoom, with a wonderful drumming instructor, a drum therapist, Jason Armstrong Baker, starting early in 2021. So again, this is following the blueprint of putting together a high quality research trial, obviously preparing the results for publication, and giving people who are interested the opportunity to participate in community-based groups in and around Baltimore so that they could continue to enjoy and reap the benefits of these kinds of music-based interventions.
Thanks so much, Alex. We have a lot of questions coming in about the types of music that might be most beneficial. So I know in your kind of opening remarks, you had mentioned use the phrase personally meaningful, right? So that's one caveat. And then also had referenced the 50 to 60 beats per minute. And so is there anything that suggests that there's certain genres or, or styles of music that are most effective? How can one find, good heart beat rhythm music? Do you have any examples that you might want to share from what you prescribe to your children and your family for, different situations, just to give the audience kind of a little bit of framework there?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot to unpack there. So I didn't say this at the beginning. I apologize. I should declare my bias now. I'm a violinist, and I would be playing classical violin professionally if I didn't go into medicine. That's been a very big part of my life since I was about 7. And it remains a big part of my life. And I hope that it will be a big part of my children's lives as well. So for me, I was trained in classical violin. And the type of music that I enjoy, for the most part, is classical music when I seek relaxation. I enjoy the Beatles. I like a lot of other rock and roll and reach across genres. For instance, bluegrass, jazz, all of these things are something I enjoy listening to and playing. But for me personally, it's Dvorak. So I love the romantic Czech composer Antonín Dvorak. Was an interesting connection to the United States, by the way. Think of his New World Symphony. And this is what I often play for myself, and also, for better or worse, something I impose on my kids. I should say a few words about that, by the way. There is a growing body of research indicating that early exposure to music lessons, even once a week in public school setting, can lead to meaningful gains among kids, both in first language acquisition. This has been looked at in a large study in Los Angeles and Chicago public schools. First language acquisition, second language acquisition, so English and Spanish, for example, improvement in STEM scores, science, technology, engineering, and math. And what's interesting is one study even that looked at the college majors that people choose and whether being exposed to music lessons during public school before college affects their choice of major. It does not appear to affect their choice of major, but it does appear to affect their scores during school and arguably even in college. The other thing to say is that even a few years of exposure to music lessons or singing lessons during early life can actually translate, it seems, into benefits when you're 50, 60, or 70. Even if you don't continue to take lessons or play your whole life. It seems that placing a greater demand for at least about 2 years, that seems to be the sweet spot, 2 years or more of being exposed to lessons leads to lasting changes in the brain, a strengthening of those connections, the neuroplasticity I was talking about before. And there could be some benefit for perceiving speech in a better way, more sensitively, even as one's hearing tends to diminish with age. So that's just an interesting point. You notice that it seems like I evaded the question about what specifically to recommend. Well, I said that I personally enjoyed Dvorak. A lot of research has been done with classical music. People have focused for no specific reason, I don't think, on the Mozart sonata for 2 pianos, K448. If you want to YouTube or Google that right now, K448. It seems like about 8.5 minutes first movement of that piano sonata may potentially enhance in a very short term cognitive performance, test performance among college students. This was published in 1993 in Nature. It apparently can reduce seizures, which is really intriguing. in children, as well as a rat model of epilepsy, of rats with seizures. This is something we plan to follow up on in 2021 at Johns Hopkins in our pediatric and adult epilepsy monitoring units. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I have to come back to the point that Kaylin mentioned of precision music medicine. We know that one size is not going to fit all, and it's a matter of really thinking and identifying what works for you. Now, is there a tool that could help you do that? Absolutely. There's a validated questionnaire that's been published for over 20 years, developed by a nurse, Linda Gerdner, GERDNER, which I'm happy to share with those who would like to do it. You could do this for yourself, for your family. It probably takes about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how hard you think about it, but you could identify genres and specific pieces that you ought to listen to. And this is a questionnaire that we used in our collaborative study with a nursing facility in Sykesville, Maryland, a few years back, where we looked at a single personally meaningful song for people with mild to moderately advanced Alzheimer's disease to look at their neuropsychiatric symptoms. So I think I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thanks so much, Alex. So we have some interesting questions, and I'm going to kind of combine two of them because I think it makes a good follow-up for what you just spoke about. So you had mentioned the impact of music in child development, language acquisition, and then also suggesting that, data is showing that there's benefit later in life, and kind of over the continuum of aging, so to speak, or the life continuum. And so as a follow-up to that, are music lessons the only way to enhance neuroplasticity? Or is there a broader based benefit from just simply listening to music? And specifically, is there any research that suggests that music training earlier on perhaps will limit neurological disease and disorder later in life? Wow,
there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, so first, let me just step back for a second, because I imagine this question may be in many people's minds pertaining to it. Is there a difference between music medicine, which is what we're talking about here, and music therapy? The answer is yes. So let me be clear. Music therapy pertains to intervention that's delivered by a trained music therapist who has attended at least 2 years of a master's level music therapy program. There are many of those around, or increasingly a PhD program in music therapy. So in many ways, a music therapist who could do individual or group sessions acts as a psychotherapist, as a cognitive behavioral therapist. There's really a lot of overlap there. In other words, there's an important relationship, longitudinal relationship that often develops between a music therapist and clients. And I want to be clear that what we're talking about here is not the same thing. We're talking about music medicine, which is either live or recorded music that is being administered by someone who's not a music therapist, either a patient themselves, the patient's family, their physician, their physical or occupational therapist, and so on and so forth, anyone but a music therapist. So the idea is, for certain things like identifying a play track for a specific part of your life, that's something that a music therapist really focuses on and has experience with and may be able to help with. And that's one of the reasons why people go to music therapists, and we partner with several wonderful music therapists at our center to work on research studies. They're consultants for us for things like playlist development. And so I just want to emphasize the importance of music therapists here and kind of delineate the difference between music therapy and music medicine. So in terms of playlists, again, it's easier now than ever before to kind of put this together. And a good starting point would be to look at Insight Timer or Headspace or the Calm apps, which have a combination of relaxation tracks, which have music-based tracks often combined with mantras or a speech. This is something that I routinely recommended for my patients with a host of different neurological illnesses, and something I recommend even more broadly now during the interesting times that we're living through in the pandemic. So I'm happy to focus on kind of more specific aspects of the multi-part question at this point. I think another part was about whether listening to music, passive listening versus active performance makes a difference. Well, so here, certainly, this is one of the key areas where more research is required, but it does seem, just based on healthy participants in studies, that you activate even more additional areas of your brain when you're actually playing a musical instrument or you're singing, as compared to just passively sitting there with headphones or just listening to Pandora or Spotify. So based on that point alone, it seems intuitive that you will do yourself more good by actually making music actively as opposed to listening to it passively. That's not to say that you can't achieve reduction in symptoms of depression, of anxiety, and achieve relaxation just by passively listening to music. Just don't count on meaningful neuroplastic changes in the brain, even if you do this regularly for 2 years, that may help you 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road. As far as the critical period question about exposure, absolutely. When it comes to early musical training exposure, there does seem to be a critical period that, depending on the study, ends between about the ages of 7 and 9 or so, or 7 or 10. So if you're exposed to music prior to that period of time, one thing that's absolutely certain is that gives you a much greater chance of becoming soloist, a high quality professional musician or singer, if you're exposed relatively early. No question about that. Whether that gives you an additional advantage in preventing Parkinson disease, Alzheimer's disease, etc., we simply don't have enough information to answer that question right now. As you can imagine, there would have to be studies that are conducted over many, many decades, right? And kids being enrolled, those who do and do not take music lessons, and followed for many decades into their 60s and 70s, when Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease tend to become more prevalent in the population, in order to answer these questions. So I think that ultimately we will have answers to these questions, but right now we cannot be definite.
Thanks, Alex. So there are a lot of questions and comments from our audience that are related to non-movement disorders and the impact of music, as a therapeutic intervention. So, we talked about Parkinson's. I would imagine that there's similar benefit that you see in atypical Parkinsonian disorders like PSP, but people are chiming in and asking about multiple sclerosis, ALS, stroke recovery, obviously memory-related disorders, so Alzheimer's and dementia. I know that we can't really go one by one, but maybe if you can talk a little bit more about what kind of that's happening in that space across your colleagues and across the country as well as the world.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So the specific intervention that I would highlight is that of rhythmic auditory stimulation, which is one that I mentioned in the slides. So again, it's been around since the 1970s. It helps various aspects of walking. In the case of Parkinson's disease, a study published last year showed that 30 minutes of walking to a metronome, which could be delivered through a smartphone application now, 30 minutes per day, Monday through Friday, for just a month, can meaningfully reduce falls in people with Parkinson's disease, which for me as a Parkinson's disease specialist is a holy grail, trying to reduce falls. Atypical Parkinsonian disorders like PSP, which you mentioned, certainly tend to have less evidence for just about anything because they are relatively rare compared to Parkinson's disease, but I'm trying to rectify that through our research. So we have some preliminary results in PSP and other atypical Parkinsonian disorders that this rhythmic auditory stimulation or rhythmic auditory cueing approach through an app-based metronome device can improve some aspects of walking and balance, at least in the short term. When it comes to stroke, there are a good amount of data, again, from rhythmic auditory stimulation to improve gait. So there's a literature on that. MS is more preliminary in multiple sclerosis, but this also has been utilized in multiple sclerosis. For brain injury, a traumatic brain injury or stroke, particularly that which affects the ability to produce speech. We talked about some of the overlaps between the speech, the network for understanding speech and for processing music. Well, music can be used to help people after injury regain their speech. I think Gabby Giffords, who had a gunshot, the Arizona senator who had a gunshot wound a number of years ago, she was able to regain a significant measure of speech using a music-based intervention called melodic intonation therapy. Again, something has been known since the 1970s and has been used to augment speech therapy for decades. ALS was mentioned. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of literature, a body of literature of music-based interventions in ALS, but it's certainly something that I would be interested in exploring further, especially now that we are increasingly shifting our focus towards diseases beyond movement disorders as our Center for Music and Medicine develops.
Thanks, Alex. This is a really good follow-up question. Is there any evidence suggesting that social or group-based application of music has a broader benefit to the effectiveness of the medicine, of the therapy, versus going it alone?
Wonderful question. So again, this is where I'm gonna frame this by saying that this is a mostly intuitive, based on studies that have been done on individuals, individual therapy or music-based interventions versus group therapy. I could tell you from the studies we've done, which have all involved group-based interventions, guitar PD, drum PDHD, more recently, the Parkinsonics singing study, of course, where we actually showed that we can meaningfully improve voice loudness, but also measures of mood and quality of life in people with Parkinson's disease. A big aspect of the group interaction is this ability to counteract isolation, which is such a big part of many illnesses. We are all, at least to some extent, feeling socially isolated now. But imagine Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or ALS on top of the social isolation that we're all experiencing right now. So we know, this has been very clearly documented, that social isolation, a tendency to enclose within oneself, is part and parcel of many impairments that drive Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders. So people get the ability to have people join a group of like-minded people, even if it's via Zoom now, even if it's virtually now, I think plays a crucial role in lifting the mood and getting people engaged, frankly, in activating many of the networks that I mentioned in the very beginning of the slide talk, many of those same networks. And I do think that it's likely that this could be engaged in a more efficient, more effective way compared to individual one-on-one therapy. However, not enough studies that have been done, actually very few, to compare group therapy versus individual therapy. And so this remains a very interesting area for investigation. You could certainly imagine instances when a family or a patient would much more strongly prefer to just work one-on-one, let's say with a music therapist, to develop a personally meaningful legacy project, which is something that a patient of mine did recently with a wonderful music therapist, Carrie Devlin, who has an adjunct appointment at Peabody. She developed a project, which Carrie eloquently described in a case report, to leave a meaningful song with lyrics and music that the patient was intimately involved in, played a role in putting together, that would serve as a remembrance for her entire family. So there are certainly instances when one-on-one therapy, especially if sensitive issues are being discussed in the course of the music-based intervention, when people might prefer to have one-on-one therapy. And this is where I encourage you to look for a local music therapist near you. But for many other things, especially for Parkinson's disease, often Alzheimer's disease, music can play an incredibly pro-social role. Another thing to mention in this context is children and adults with autism spectrum disorder struggle with a number of social tasks. And there is growing evidence that group music involvement can actually improve some of the behaviors and social skills of people on the autism spectrum.
Thanks, Alex. So we are, believe it or not, have moved through the majority of our time together. We're just going to take 2 more quick questions, and then I want to do our best to keep everyone on schedule to depart at 2 o'clock. So there are some questions. People are interested in the notion of social prescribing. I know you said that we're not here yet in Maryland, right? But any idea of timeline, and once we're there, you know, what would that look like? What kind of doctor could you know, prescribe music-based intervention? What would reimbursement look like? Would this be an insurance, you know, a coverable by insurance thing? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point, I just want to be clear, this is entirely speculative. I think it's not lost on anyone that to integrate social prescribing into the current American healthcare climate will be a monumental challenge. And this is something I've discussed with colleagues across the music and medicine world, of course. This is partly why pilots have begun in the UK and Canada, where there's a national health service. So in a natural way, they could centralize this and integrate this. So the UK thinks of this as having actual coordinators, social prescribing coordinators, which are not necessarily the same as the patient's clinician, who could coordinate the social prescribing programs. If you're asking me what I envision here, I think more practically would be individual clinicians, whether it's your physician, your nurse practitioner, your physician's assistant, who, or even a nurse who is thinking of, you know, well, for this patient, perhaps getting involved in a music-based, community-based activity could be really helpful. And it's something that's mentioned. It's already happening now. You know, I informally refer my patients to these kinds of programs, of course, and we do the best we can to try to help offset some of the cost of these programs as well. But in terms of where I'd like things to end up, of course, it would be wonderful to have health insurance cover these types of interventions that have a growing body of literature supporting their evidence. Now the NIH is paying attention and listening. Note that, the Music and Health Partnership, and to my knowledge, that have very few, if any, side effects across a multitude of research studies that have been published on music-based interventions. So what I'd like to see a Medicare and other health insurance coverage programs for music therapy. Let's start there, which is currently, you know, still not in place, or more broadly for social prescribing for clinicians such as myself to be able to prescribe a covered service. Of course, is it going to take a significant national, perhaps international effort with patients and families helping to lead the way by advocating with people in Congress and lawmakers? Absolutely. And this is something that I'm very excited to be a part of in the decades to come.
Okay, very good. So, you know, I'm seeing a lot of comments and some questions in the Q&A. People are, you know, asking about how they might be able to help, right? And so you had mentioned the National Institutes of Health's fantastic music and health grant program, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how work like yours gets funded in a normal, you know, in a normal environment. And that might address people wanting to know how they might be able to help out.
Thank you, Kaylin. And thank you to all those who posed the question. In order to successfully compete for the type of NIH grant that the Music and Health Program engenders, there needs to be a significant amount of prior work, preliminary data, as we call it. To generate preliminary data, there need to be pilot or you know, initial clinical steps or clinical research studies. And these cost significant amounts of money and time in terms of effort and coordination. So in order to stand up our research studies so far, we have, for the most part, secured funding internally through various mechanisms available at Johns Hopkins. But you know, it's clear that with additional support, we'd be able to roll a number of programs out that currently we simply don't have the bandwidth of support. The other part of this, which is crucial, as I mentioned, is that we have a blueprint where we want to support the type of music-based and rhythm-based interventions that we study out in the community, in the greater Baltimore community, particularly. And this is something that ideally we want to make available with little or no cost to those participating or who would like to participate. And for that, there certainly would be a welcome opportunity to support those community-based programs, such as Parkinsonics, such as drumming for Parkinson's disease and Huntington disease, such as the PD Strummers program done in partnership with Peabody.
Sounds good, Alex. Well, thank you so much for that. I think that we have one more slide if you might be able to move it forward. And if you are interested in learning more about Dr. Pantelyat and his colleagues' work, how to support it, including those community-based programs, all of which are, really coming out of the Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorders Center at Johns Hopkins, please feel free to reach out to me by phone or by email. And I'm also going to make a commitment to all of you who have asked some questions that might have been really, really focused or we just didn't have time to get to. We will be providing some follow-up from the webinar broadly to everyone, the slide deck, as well as the link to the recording, so you can feel free to share it or revisit it. And then we'll be also following up with some of our attendees who have asked really focused questions individually that we didn't have a chance to get to. So with that, thank you so much. Please take good care, stay healthy, and we wish you all of the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Kaylin and Jamie, for organizing so wonderfully.